A 279 apartment Art Deco fortress on the corner of Nanjing Road and the Bund. A penthouse on the 11th floor with the only balcony in the building. Designed to look like the bridge of a ship because the man who lived there saw himself as the captain of Shanghai itself. 1,800 properties in a single city. A private studio in Bombay. A racing stable in Newmarket that would one day win the Epsom Derby 4 times. Most people, when they think about who funded the British Empire, picture the Bank of England, the East India Company, maybe the Rothschilds in their counting houses in London. They are looking at the front of the building. Behind the front, in the shadows of the empire's most lucrative century, stood another family. A family the British called the Rothschilds of the East. A family that, at its peak, controlled an estimated 70% of the entire opium trade flowing from India into China. This is the story of the dynasty the history books quietly forgot. The family whose ships, warehouses, and bankers built the financial backbone of an empire on the back of a single addictive flower. We are going to uncover how a refugee family that arrived in Bombay with almost nothing in 1832 went on to dominate the largest narcotics trade in human history. We are tracking the docks they built, the wars they profited from, the British royals they dined with, and the $3 billion fortune the patriarch left behind. Wait until you hear what happened to all of it. By the end of this video, you will understand why every cup of tea, every yard of cotton, and every pound of opium that moved through the British Empire passed through one family's hands. For the better part of 2 centuries, the standard story of the British Empire has been a story of institutions. The East India Company, the Royal Navy, Parliament in Westminster, Lloyd's of London, the great chartered banks of the city. The empire, in this telling, was a machine, vast, faceless, and bureaucratic. A pink stain on a globe maintained by clerks in starched collars. And the version that gets taught in schools tends to focus on the things that sound noble. Tea, cotton, the railway, the English language, the civilizing mission, even the darker chapters, the famines, the massacres, the opium wars themselves, tend to be framed as the actions of governments and generals. Faceless men in faceless ministries making faceless decisions. Most people walk away from that story with a single image in their head. The empire as a machine, run by the state, paid for by taxes, defended by redcoats. It is a comforting story. It is also a fundamentally incomplete one. Because empires are not built by ministries. Empires are built by money. And money, in the 19th century, did not flow from Whitehall down to the colonies. It flowed the other way, from the docks of Calcutta and Bombay and Shanghai, up through private trading houses, through merchant banks, into the city of London, and only then into the coffers of the state. The British Empire was not just a political project. It was a commercial one, and at the very center of its most profitable trade route, the route that made the rest of the imperial system viable, sat a single family, a family the textbooks barely mention. Here is the anomaly that historians keep stumbling over. By the 1870s, the British Empire was running on a strange and unstable financial trick. Britain wanted Chinese tea. Britain wanted Chinese silk. Britain wanted Chinese porcelain. But the Chinese, as the emperors had made very clear, wanted almost nothing the British produced in return. The trade deficit was enormous. The silver was draining out of London at a rate that threatened the Bank of England itself. So the British found something the Chinese would take. Opium imports into China surged from 200 chests annually in the early 1700s to 4,500 by 1800, and exploded to 40,000 chests by 1838. After the 1842 Treaty of Nanking, the trade climbed to 70,000 chests a year, roughly 4,550 metric tons. That is not a trade. That is a flood. And here's the question almost no one asks. Who was actually moving all that opium? Who owned the warehouses in Patna where it was stockpiled? Who owned the clipper ships that ran it across the South China Sea? Who owned the docks it landed at, the banks that financed it, and the insurance houses that protected the cargo? Pull on that thread, and the answer keeps coming back to the same surname. In 1829, a man named David Sassoon fled Baghdad with a price on his head. He was the son of the Pasha's chief treasurer, born into Baghdad aristocracy in 1792, but a change in regime forced him to escape, first to Basra and then to British-controlled Bombay. He arrived in India in 1832 with his wife and a handful of children. He set up a tiny counting house at 9 Tamarind Street in Bombay. From the outside, it looked like nothing, one of 1,000 small trading offices in a colonial port. But David had 3 things almost no one else in Bombay had. He had multilingual sons, eventually 14 of them, who he could place in every major port across Asia. He had a network of Baghdadi Jewish merchants stretching from Basra to Hong Kong, all of whom communicated in a Judeo-Arabic dialect written in Hebrew letters, a code so obscure that British competitors literally could not read intercepted Sassoon correspondence. And he had impeccable timing. Because in 1839, just 7 years after David arrived in Bombay, the First Opium War broke out. By 1842, Britain had won. The Treaty of Nanking forced China to open 5 treaty ports, granted Britain Hong Kong, and made the British the most favored trading nation in the Chinese market. The Sassoons were ready. David sent his sons out across the new map. Albert took London, Elias took Shanghai, Reuben, Arthur, and Frederick took the British social circuit. Every major node in the new imperial trade network had a Sassoon stationed at it, and every Sassoon was reporting back to Bombay in a language no rival could decode. Then they went vertical. The Sassoons embraced new technology like the telegraph. They vertically integrated, buying up steamships to transport opium, venturing into maritime insurance to protect those ships, and sitting on the boards of the banks that financed the entire operation. Read that again. They didn't just sell the drug. They owned the ships that carried it. They owned the insurance that covered the ships. They owned the banks that financed the insurance. And they sat on the boards of those banks. They had a hand in the founding of HSBC in 1865. In 1875, they built the Sassoon docks, the first commercial wet docks in Bombay, and the literal point of departure for Indian cotton and opium heading east. They owned the gate. They owned the ship that left through the gate. They owned the bank that loaned the buyer the money. They owned the insurer that covered the loss. They owned the warehouse on the other end. This is what economists today call a chokepoint monopoly. The Sassoons didn't just dominate a trade, they became the trade. By the 1860s and 1870s, the numbers had become almost incomprehensible. David Sassoon and company controlled an estimated 70% of the entire India to China opium market, surpassing well-known rivals like Russell and Company, Jardine Matheson, and Dent and Company. 70% of the largest narcotics trade in human history. When David Sassoon died in 1864, he left his 14 children a fortune of approximately £4 million, the equivalent of about $500 million in today's US dollars by one calculation, and as much as $3 billion by others. Either figure makes him, at the time of his death, one of the wealthiest private individuals on the planet. To understand the scale, consider what that money was actually buying. The Sassoons bought their way into the City of London. In 1872, David's son, Abdallah, now using the anglicized name Albert, was awarded a knighthood. The following year, he was given the freedom of the City of London, an honor normally reserved for British-born subjects, and noted in the official commemorative brochure as the first time it had ever been bestowed on an East Indian merchant. They bought their way into the aristocracy. The Sassoon brothers became personal friends and confidants of the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII. They were guests at Sandringham, They hunted with dukes. They married into European nobility. They were, within a single generation, transformed from refugees into pillars of the British establishment. And they bought their way into the Imperial Information Network. Rachel Sassoon Beer, a daughter of the family, ran two of Britain's most powerful newspapers, the Sunday Times from 1893 to 1904, and the Observer, which she also edited. A Sassoon was, quite literally, editing the news the British public read about its own empire. Now think about what that combination meant. The family controlled the trade. They controlled the ships. They controlled the banks. They were friends with the king. They edited the newspapers. Every time a British soldier sailed east on a Royal Navy ship to defend a treaty port, he was defending Sassoon cargo. Every time a Lancashire mill bought Indian cotton, he was, somewhere up the chain, buying it from a Sassoon. Every time a Chinese addict bought a pipe of Malwa opium in a Shanghai alley, the profit margin made its way, eventually, to a townhouse in Mayfair. The empire didn't fund the Sassoons. The Sassoons funded the empire. By the 1920s, the family had completed its transformation from Baghdadi merchants into European aristocrats. And nowhere was that transformation more spectacular than in the life of Sir Victor Sassoon, David's great-grandson, the third Baronet of Bombay, and the last great showman of the dynasty. Victor was educated at Harrow and Cambridge. He flew with the Royal Flying Corps in the First World War, took shrapnel that left him walking with two canes for the rest of his life, and inherited the family's Eastern Empire in 1924. And then he did something extraordinary. He moved most of it to Shanghai. Sassoon arrived in Shanghai in the 1920s as a serious investor in real estate, with an estimated capital of around $85 million. In less than a decade, he transformed the face of the city with a series of luxury hotels and apartment buildings. By the time of the 1949 Communist Revolution, he owned over 1,900 buildings in the city. Picture this. In 1929, he opened the Cathay Hotel, today the Fairmont Peace Hotel, on the corner of Nanjing Road and the Bund. It was China's first American-style Art Deco skyscraper. His personal penthouse sat on the 11th floor, with the only balcony in the entire building, deliberately designed to resemble the bridge of a ship. From that balcony, Victor Sassoon ran a hospitality empire that defined an era. Noel Coward finished his play Private Lives in the Cathay penthouse in 1930. Charlie Chaplin stayed there. George Bernard Shaw stayed there. Chiang Kai-shek stayed there. The fashionable private parties Victor held on the top floor were legendary in the Shanghai demi-monde. Costume balls, tea dances, masquerades. Victor was famously quoted as saying there was only one race better than the Jews, and that was the Derby. The man was obsessed with horses. He bought the Bungalow Stud near Newmarket in 1925, renamed it Eve's Stud, and over the following decades, his stables won the Epsom Derby 4 times, with Pinza, Crapello, Hard Ridden, and St. Paddy. A man who was born in Naples, raised in England, made his fortune in India, doubled it in Shanghai, and won the most prestigious horse race in the world 4 times. That was the Sassoon lifestyle at its peak. And yet, every brick of the Cathay Hotel, every Derby winner in the Newmarket paddock, every chandelier in the Mayfair townhouses traced back to the same source, to a flower grown in Bengal, to a clipper ship leaving the Sassoon docks at dawn, to a chest of opium being unloaded on the Shanghai Bund. So what happened to it all? The short answer is, history caught up with the family. In 1907, Britain agreed with India and China that within a decade, opium exports and cultivation would be barred. By 1913, Britain tightened the screw further. Both Sassoon companies, however, continued trading the drug, attempting to squeeze every last penny from the now discredited trade. The Indian opium trade to East Asia was alive and kicking as late as the 1920s, several years after the British and Chinese governments had officially agreed to halt it. Then came the wars, the Japanese invasion of Shanghai, the communist revolution that nationalized every Sassoon property in China overnight, Indian independence, the collapse of the imperial system that had made the dynasty possible in the first place. The historian Cecil Roth likened the shape of the family's dynasty to a diamond, starting at a point, widening rapidly, and tapering disastrously towards the bottom. Victor died in 1961 in the Bahamas with no children. The baronetcy went extinct. The opium fortune dissolved into trusts, charities, and quiet inheritances scattered across continents. But the questions linger. How much of the modern British financial system, HSBC, Standard Chartered, the city's old merchant banks, is built on foundations that were poured during those opium decades? How many of the hospitals, museums, and stately homes that bear the Sassoon name across India, China, and Britain were paid for, ultimately, in the addiction of millions of Chinese peasants? How honest is the official story of the British Empire when an entire family of this scale can almost vanish from the textbooks? There are still Sassoons today, still trusts, still property portfolios, still quiet philanthropic foundations operating out of London, Nassau, and New York. The family is no longer building empires, but the empires they helped build are still standing. Every dynasty in history has found the same thing. They find the choke point. They find the one place where a flow of goods, or money, or information has to pass through, and they put themselves at that point and charge a toll. For the Medici, it was the wool trade. For the Fuggers, it was copper and silver. For the Astors, it was Manhattan real estate. For the Sassoons, it was a flower grown in Bengal, sold to a continent, protected by the most powerful navy on Earth. The choke points change. The logic is eternal. So the question for you is this. When you look at the great fortunes of today, the ones being built right now in tech, in shipping, in commodities, in finance, which families are quietly building the next Sassoon empire? And in 100 years, when historians look back, which everyday product will turn out to have been the opium of our age? If you found this story as fascinating as I did, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. And next time, we are going inside another dynasty that built itself on a single choke point. A family that, for nearly a century, set the price of the most valuable stone on Earth. The De Beers story is darker than you think.